everyone. I'm Ashok, and this is the ninth edition of Mind Watching. Uh, Sometimes I call it Mind Watch, but the logo says Mind Watching. I personally haven't figured out what to settle on. I'm just guessing that at some point I will figure that out. But meanwhile, I'm very excited about this particular session, even as I am sad that Rukmini will not be with us today, because as I was explaining to Daniel, our guest, who will introduce himself very soon, Rukmini is a very much in demand consultant and facilitator, and she is doing some very interesting work offsite today. So this clashes with her professional schedule. But welcome, everyone. And if you are watching this on our YouTube channel, the Village Idiot Studio YouTube channel, I hope you will check out a wealth of videos that we have on a range of topics. As I said, this is the ninth session of Mind Watching. I'm going to, I want to also give you a sense of the structure. And this is for those who have shown up today. As you know, most of the conversation is unfortunately going to be monopolized by Daniel and me, because this is a conversation between two people. And we are trying to model a very different kind of conscious, deliberate, thoughtful conversing. So he and I are going to talk on the subject of social contract. And I'll explain in a bit what I mean by that. And I would encourage all of you to use the chat function to put down any thoughts or ideas or questions that you have. In the last 20 to 25 minutes, we will pick up on your thoughts and give you an opportunity to, particularly if the group is small, to talk on camera and share your reflections. But your questions are very important. Now, this particular subject, social contract, is the one that connected or brought Daniel and me together. I happened to write an article for a Substack called Why I Don't Beat Up on Conservatives. And it resonated with him. And he took this idea much further in his own writings. And so we have this, we have been bonded on the idea of how societies agree to come together, particularly in a democratic context. And as I mentioned in my announcements, this is totally counterintuitive. And I'm hoping that you, the viewer, will walk away from this with a radically different understanding of how human rights, freedoms, minority rights in particular, how they're completely contingent on the contract between people in power and the rest of us. So I'd like to introduce, or rather ask Daniel to introduce himself. Daniel, tell us who you are.
Hi Ashok, my name's Daniel. Hello everyone. Basically, by training, I'm a barrister, that's to say, advocate and teacher. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm a senior fellow at a democracy think tank based in Canada called Section 1, where we're trying to build active citizenship, which is to say that people are more aware of what it means to be a citizen, to be involved, and to not basically sleepwalk into autocracy, and developing certain school curricula so that children in their knowledge of civics basically are more aware of their roles and responsibilities as citizens. I am also the chief editor and writer at a Substack called Ger and Shalom. That's war and peace in a few languages there. And basically, it has a similar project there. It's a kind of, I would say, it's a bit of a mixture of current affairs and philosophy, but it's about developing what it means to be a citizen in the Western world, again, because of us sleepwalking into authoritarianism, forgetting how our nations were formed, forgetting what the objective of our nations were. And it was on that Substack where I've written a few books, including a book I'm drafting at the moment on the social contract, that I first met Ashok, and he, as he said, did an essay about conservatism and liberalism, and that inspired me to write a number of pieces, longer pieces, about this issue. So it's something that we think is very important, and that's why Ashok's invited me today to speak to you.
Thank you. Tell us where you live.
Where I live? Well, I'm a bit of a nomad. At the moment, I live in Spain, in the northeast of Spain. I'm from the UK. In fact, I'm from a county called Berkshire, which is where you find Windsor Castle, and Runnymede, which is where the Magna Carta was signed, and not far from Oxford University. So in that kind of area, it's called Reading's, where I was born. But I've been and lived in a few different countries, but currently I'm living in Spain.
And an interesting fact that Daniel shared with me a while ago was that he did his law the same place that Mahatma Gandhi did his legal studies.
Yes.
So, anyway,
I also
thank you.
went. I was also at the Lincoln's Inn, when I was called to the bar, I went to Lincoln's Inn, and that's where Jinnah went to became a barrister. So when I went to there is when basically over 50% of the people in there were Pakistani, and I remember when my parents came to call to the bar, and they're just like regular guys, and so I said, "Hello, these are my parents." And hello, this is so and so. He's the head of Pakistan's nuclear program. so, so that's where they all go to become barristers, because their initial leader was a barrister.
Fascinating. Thank you. Welcome, Peter. Welcome, Amrita. Good to see you folks here. And I am going to start off today's conversation by
Mm.
asking Daniel to define for us what social contract means in as succinct a manner as possible. What is this creature called social contract? And why is it important?
Well, it's what binds us together as a society with our obligations, and basically what creates stability in our society. And that's the key word here for this. It's stability, and what you're prepared to give up for stability, and what rights do you think that the government should continue to give you, even if you're happy with stability, but is there some place that you're not prepared to go? And what is the basis of this stability? Now, traditionally, when people have talked about the social contract, and there's been many famous thinkers who've thought about the social contract, and they basically put forward the idea that the social contract is based on equality, which is to say that before we effectively created our political associations, we all lived free and equal. A bit like America in the pioneering stage in the Old West, where all of these people came from closed, densely packed European societies, and then they're in these vast open spaces, and they're all basically effectively free in their own governments. So they cannot accept any strong government on them because they are free. And that's why American conservatives, as opposed to European conservatives, have this big emphasis on freedom. But anyway, all of these social contracts are kind of predicated on the idea of some kind of equality, be it, if you like, Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, well, we're going to give up our freedom for stability under some kind of autocratic regime. Or you've got John Locke, and he says, well, we were free and we had certain innate rights like right to property and life and so on. And though we've given up these things for stability, the government has the duty to protect these rights. And you have John Rawls, who's the most modern of these philosophers, who, although he's saying that there wasn't actually a moment when we signed a social contract, he's saying, again, we decide our obligations based on what we would have agreed to before we got into the social contract. And not knowing what kind of place we would have had in the societal pecking order, of course, we would have chosen as equal a society as possible, albeit where there would be some lack of equality, so that, the tides are rising all boats. Anyway, all of these theories, they've got very different ideas of what a good society is. John Rawls has got the idea of a kind of social democratic, whereas someone like Thomas Hobbes was in favor of, the divine right of kings in the time of the English Civil War. But what I think we're putting forward is that equality is a little bit of a chimera, and we need to get to the actual real basis of why we've come together as a society. Once we've identified that, we'll understand the nature of the social contract. We're not saying that we don't like equality, but we're going to say that though that might be a destination, that is not the basis of the social contract. And I think that's what we're going to explore further today.
Thank you. Uh, and you're more of a scholar than I am. Uh, and it's very important. Uh, I think it would be important for me to explain why I or how I
Mm.
came to this understanding, my present understanding of equality as well as minority majority relationships. I'm a dyed in the wool liberal. I realized later I was a classic liberal. In other words, even though I grew up for the first 35 years of my life, I was in India, and I, I I was absolutely fascinated with Indian democracy. It was messy, it was corrupt, it was flawed. At one time, when Amrita and we were classmates in design school, when we literally on the first day of our joining college, Mrs. Gandhi took away our freedoms and declared emergency. So there's a way in which the idea of democracy, of freedom, was deeply important for me. It also became important, and I don't want to go into the many details, which I will be talking about in my book. But in 1971, my parents went to the Arab world, the Middle East, and from 71 to about 86, every year I would go there for my vacations. And stepping off the flight in Dubai or Kuwait or Abu Dhabi, it was almost like I was gagged. I felt the extraordinary heaviness in the air of being terrified of authority in a way that I never felt in India except during the emergency. And
Mm.
even then, Indians don't do anything very well. Even our dictatorship was loosey goosey. It was kind of extremely flawed. So we weren't really terrified even during the emergency. We were very careful about what we said. Now, coming out of that era, I became a very strong advocate for complete and absolute freedom and equality, and particularly justice for minorities. Fast forward to 1989 and the Satanic verses and the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, which I talk of often. That was another turning point for me when I saw that my democratic country, India, was the first country to ban satanic verses. And why? Because they were nervous about Muslim violence. So suddenly it struck me, oh my God, our freedom of speech is dependent on other people not becoming violent. How is that freedom? Particularly after that, and this is the reason I left design, which was my first profession, and went into mediation and dialogue facilitation. I became completely convinced of the importance of free speech, because you cannot have dialogue if one or both of the parties are nervous or scared of speaking their mind. I'm not going to use the word truth, it's too loaded, but they have to have the right to speak their mind, even if it offends someone else.
Mm.
And as a, I, I practice this on the ground. So again, this is why I say I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic. I'm not an activist. I worked with communities, organizations, interfaith relationships, literally trying to create environments where people could speak openly, say the kind of things that
Mm.
would not just get them arrested, but even get them killed outside of my facilitated environment, and help them arrive at consensus or a kind of agreement that allowed for coexistence. The groups that I brought together for 25 years didn't always agree on everything, but they found a way to work together. Everything was going very well. I felt finally I found my métier, my milieu. This is what my calling is. Okay. And then in 2014, Modi came to power in India. But the signs were already starting to show up in other places. I was in India. I came back from Boston in 2005 to set up my company, Metaculture, which did this work. But by 2008, 7, 8, the subprime crisis, sitting in India, I saw the way the world looked at America and saw that America was economically dysfunctional, while China was so competent because they were able to keep the global economy going when America was floundering. Then the Syrian crisis, and because I had already been working with Muslims for a long time, I realized that the Syrian refugees coming into Europe would be very difficult to assimilate. And while most of my work was really based on minority rights and diversity, I started developing a healthy respect for the first time of what it took to protect liberal democratic societies. And I realized slowly that liberal democratic societies could only survive if the people agreed on certain foundational values. And I had this image once from in the US when I was visiting India, and I think it was 2001. And from the airport, I was driving to my parents' home. Uh, and suddenly I had this image of my friends in Boston, beautiful, lovely, liberal, wonderful people. If 100 of my friends, and I had a huge network in Boston. If 100 of my friends showed up in the little township that my parents lived in, I suddenly realized it would be destroyed. It would be completely destroyed by my beautiful, lovely, uh, uh, really wonderful friends, because my parents' township was conservative. It had its own values. And the sight of my friends not just their clothing, but their sexual mores, their political ideas would completely shatter uh, that conservative environment. Now, I say this because I got the same feeling when Angela Merkel finally allowed in 1 million Syrians. And it struck me, how the hell are Germans going to assimilate 1 million Syrians who come from a completely different cultural or religious environment? And then, of course, you had Brexit, and Modi came. uh, and I suddenly realized that my work, it took me about till the age of 37 to 30, no, 37 to 38 to find my calling in peace building and mediation. And I suddenly realized it was a pack of cards. Everything that I had built over 25 years of practice, my theoretical foundations, the work which I thought was very important, and don't get me wrong, I did help organizations and people doing my work. But the election of a right-wing Hindu nationalist government immediately made redundant my entire premise. And in one of my, about 2 weeks after Modi got elected, I brought together, I was in the process of doing the Hindu Muslim dialogues, and I brought together this group. We were meeting once a month for a full day, very intense conversations. And suddenly I realized when they came together that the temperature, the climate had changed. I realized that the Hindus sat back in their chairs, and one of them literally asked, "Why do we need to talk anymore? We are in power. Muslims have to do what we tell them to do." Obviously, it changed everything. It's one of the reasons I came to the US. But I want to come back. I want to come to the West here. I saw that played my own very minor part in the destruction of Indian democracy. Now, some people will say it's not destroyed, there are elections. That's a very superficial form of democracy. The real kind of democracy that the West has aspired to, particularly in the last 50 odd years after the civil rights movement, the kind of equality was completely predicated on a social contract between people who, by and large, shared the same values.
mm,
Even when we talk about minorities, we're talking of minorities who believed in the Bill of Rights.
mm,
We're talking about minorities who said, yes, I don't really like your religion or I don't like your politics, but I agree with your right to exist and to say that. And as we all know, that agreement has been shattered. Some people call it the social contract, some people call it a political contract, but we are in the situation where, as all of you know, I'm not telling you something you don't know, that the Western social contract has been completely shattered to the extent that, and I'll end with this anecdote. I've been in Washington, D.C. now for more than 8 years. Not a single person that I know, including peace builders, are interested in even remotely trying to understand those that they disagree with.
mm,
Not at all. The nicest, most loving people I know, and most people doing this work, decided not to make mega money being investment bankers or whatever else. They chose these fields because they were committed to these ideals, and they do not have and are not manifesting any democratic values at all. I hate to say this, but I have to stop with that thought. And Daniel, feel free to respond to me. Feel free to pick up any thread and go
Mm,
with it. You may
mm,
also ask me questions.
mm. Well, perhaps if I'll start and then end with what you've said about Syrian refugees and immigration, which has been a big issue here in Europe, particularly. You know, at the beginning, you asked me who I was, and I just listed off some facts. But perhaps it would have been better if I'd said this: I'm from a real minority. Now, when people say minority, particularly I know in America, you say minorities, African American, Hispanic, you're talking about huge groups of people, enormous groups of people who form part of, I don't know what the percentage is, but an enormous percentage and have demographic weight into society. They are very much part of the fabric of the country and makers of the social contract in that country. I know what it's like to be a minority of a minority of a minority of a minority, because not only am I Sephardi Jewish in somewhere country where there aren't many of us, and no one looks at all like me. I live in an area where there's no one like me, not even in the Jewish community, as it were, in Britain, don't look anything like me, and I don't live with them either. And so I'm in a minority of about 3 people. So for me, even though my family have been in the UK since the times of Oliver Cromwell, the Civil War, the fact is, I know what it is to be a minority, which is to say, you have no demographic weight within the society. And you are reliant on the social contract between the people who have got control. And that in the United States includes people who are so called minorities, who are in fact very powerful within the society. If you're in a small minority, which means you're almost by yourself, you're reliant on the rights that are granted by the people above. So, in that sense, I'm liberal because I want to protect the rights the minorities have. I want that stability of our society. Otherwise, we're in chaos. I think it was the prophet Jeremiah who said, we've got to pray for the government of the country, else we'll all end in flames, or something like that. And for us, that's true. For the privileged children at Harvard, that's not true, because it wouldn't matter if they were in a dictatorship, they would still be the most powerful people in that country. And they could live in any society. I could not. So why is someone like me and someone like you talking about, in respectful terms, about conservative people in the society, which we are not members of? Is because, as you've alluded to just now, they are the people who create the stability of society, which we rely on and we need to continue. So, conservative, what does it mean? As I said, it has a particular meaning in America, really, but generally, as Roger Scruton said, an English philosopher, what a conservative really is, which is, if you like, if you imagine the country as some kind of organism, that then the conservative is part of the organism of the country. They grow with the country. They kind of embody it without knowing it. And there might be change, but it's organic change within that country. So they're part of that nation implicitly. They're not like me in the clouds above it, looking at it from above. Now, it's nothing to do with rich and poor. In fact, the social conservatives, the majority, is the alliance of, if you will, the wealthy, the powerful on one hand, who are small in number but big in power, and the poor social conservatives, who are big in number, so they have a lot of aggregate power, and they get together and create the stability of society. So in the United Kingdom, mass franchise happened more or less in about 1872. There was a Reform Act. Still women couldn't vote, still some poor people who did not cover a certain property level couldn't vote. Indians could vote. There was actually a couple of Indian MPs in the Victorian British Parliament, but women couldn't vote. And what was the alliance there? Because how did the Conservative Party of Benjamin Disraeli, how did they win under a mass franchise system? Well, they combined the wealthy, as it were, with the votes of the masses of patriotic people who were part of the organism of the country. And together, democratically, that was more people than the merchants and the metropolitan kind of liberals, if we want to put it that way. So they created a society, and it was predicated on the idea of, well, love of country, love of our country, that we're part of a national story. The agreement was, though, we will improve the rights of the poorest in society. There will be, we are going to stave off revolution. We are going to, bit by bit, increase rights for the unemployed, for people who need sick benefit, eventually a national health service. And so eventually there was this unity. And after the Second World War, I don't know if you know that in the Second World War, there was a coalition government. So even though Churchill was the prime minister, it was a conservative Labour Liberal coalition. And after the war, the Labour Party, the Socialist Party won. But many of the things which seem radical, like the nationalisation of many industries, like the growth of new towns, the national insurance payments, and the National Health Service, many of the things they did seem radical. But in fact, they happened with the consensus of the wealthy, with the Conservative Party, because even in the Second World War, there was something called the Beveridge Report, which the Conservative Party endorsed, which was getting rid of evils in society that existed during the two wars, where you had, for example, a lot of squalor, slums, massive levels of poverty, and there was consensus to remove it. So the reason that socialist government works so well compared to most of them is that it was a consensus between, as it were, the conservative, as in the Conservative Party, the wealthier people, and the kind of mass of poor social conservatives. And so we had a huge consensus, at least to 1979, in this country, in the UK, I mean. Now, we've come to the problem with what's happened now with mass immigration, which is what you've spoken about. There's a few issues which have breached the social contract. But you've mentioned, Ashok, with the issues of the Syrian immigration, and there have been many others, which is that the people in the country who form the social conservatives, particularly the social conservative poor, the people who would have voted for the socialists after the Second World War, these people are not in favor of mass migration. But I'll tell you what I mean by mass migration. In 1997, when Tony Blair came to power, it was in the tens of thousands net migration. Last year of the Conservative government just now, not many years afterwards, it was nearly 1 million net migration. So although there has always been migration, and it's been welcomed, particularly by people like me and people like you, nonetheless, such an increase is not approved of by the people who make up the social contract. And the wealthy people are ignoring that because they've got tax havens, they can escape it, they don't feel the effect of it. It's not, for me, the issue so much now whether we should have that or we shouldn't have that, but that there's been no consent for it. And this comes not from them, but from me, because if this breaks apart, if there's xenophobia because they're allowing huge migration which isn't agreed upon, then it's not the Harvard boys that are going to suffer. It's going to be the people who are in the tiny minorities, the real minorities, not Hispanics, but real minorities, the people who are like just one or two people in the country. We're going to suffer because we rely on the rights granted slowly and surely by the majority. And the moment they feel that people are taking the mickey and they're not listening, which they haven't really been listening for the last 20 years, we will suffer. So this is an issue which we need to raise now, not from the perspective of being racist or anything, but from the perspective of wanting the stability of society so that all of us can continue to enjoy the rights we have enjoyed thus far.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm just going to continue to invite you folks to put down your thoughts on chat. Um, I want to respond to two things here, Daniel. The first thing, of course, is to just acknowledge that your perspective, being a Britisher, is very important here. Because in most conversations on democracy, partly because I'm living in India, I mean, in the US, people talk about American democracy all the time. And Americans, particularly, are abysmally ignorant of democracy anywhere else. They are, even the most educated people uh, would have been completely surprised by what you said right now, Daniel. So it's very important for us to look at another country, particularly a country that can actually claim to be the mother of all democracies. Now, the Western experience of democracy is also very different from the Eastern and Southern.
Mm.
And I want to just touch upon the Indian experience of democracy and social contract here. You see, and people, I've been saying this for the past, I want to say, 10 years. And it's one of the reasons most of my liberal progressive peers have abandoned me. People don't like hearing that democracy, as we understand it, is a purely Western concept. Without the Reformation, without the Renaissance, without the Enlightenment, without the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the two world wars, and the civil rights movement in the West, we wouldn't be here today. So let me take a step back and talk about India. India is we've been proud of the fact that it's the biggest democracy in the world, and I don't want to diminish the importance of Indian democracy because India manages, for a poor, extremely sloppy country, it manages to pull off the most amazing
Mm.
elections every 4 or 5 years. I mean, it is a logistical masterpiece what India manages to do with minimal violence. And for a poor country, it has, particularly until 2014, it managed to hold on to a very complex, very diverse society. As a democracy, it would have been very easy for India to become a monarchy or a dictatorship. It did, even under Modi, it's not. It's still a dysfunctional, extremely flawed democracy. But why did India become a democracy? When you had 95% of illiteracy, forget the uneducated, illiteracy, and the poverty was again in the high 90% in 1947. India had Western educated, Fabian, socialist, visionary leaders. Like Gandhi was not a socialist, but people like Nehru and many people like Ambedkar in his cabinet, these were visionaries who wanted for a extraordinarily poor, desperate country which had been colonized and had never been independent. It didn't even exist as a country ever. It wanted the best, the most enlightened form of government. And it was literally Nehru and his small coterie of leaders who pushed to create Indian democracy. There was no social contract. It was sold to Indians. through the moral power that Gandhi had, through Nehru's credibility and reputation. And this is for me the most fascinating aspect of Indian democracy, and which is why India survived for so many years, unlike Middle Eastern or African or Latin American or other Asian democracies. The momentum that people like Nehru created and the institutions they created, I have to give credit to the British colonial administration, which put in place the bureaucracy, the judiciary, and India even had, during colonial times, a form of self representation. But Nehru built on this. And it's that momentum that continued to keep Indian democracy going. But as I said, and this is very important, we never had a social contract because we have always been extremely hierarchical. Indians define themselves by who's above them and who's below them. It's manifests most powerfully in the caste system. But even without the caste system, we are hierarchical, we are traditional, we completely bypass the Enlightenment. So we are not a reason based society. We produce the largest number of engineers on this planet, but these engineers are not necessarily representative of the Enlightenment mind. It's a technique, it's a set of knowledge that they have, which allows them to do things. But we do not have the liberal mindset. Now, this is important to understand because after, I didn't feel the same. But after Modi came, it suddenly struck me that India could never be a democracy. We were an aberration, a freak. But even before Modi came, from 2005 to 2014, when I was trying to do dialogue work, conflict resolution work, which is basically democracy building, I discovered Indians don't want to dialogue. We want to talk. We want to argue. But we don't want to sit down and we don't ask questions like, Peter, what did you really mean? We immediately jump to a conclusion and attack that conclusion. So the structure, the mechanisms, the values inherent in dialogue, we don't have it at all. Secondly, and this was mind blowing for me, coming out of the negotiation, conflict resolution practice in that came out of Harvard and MIT. They have something called the program on negotiation. So I'm really a child of that in a way. Uh, I tried to bring together corporations, civil societies, NGOs, labor unions, and government to work on very complex disputes. And it became very clear to me nobody wanted to come to the table. If you were powerful, you got what you wanted without negotiation. And if you were weak, the most surprising thing for me was civil society. I thought in my naivete that civil society would want a seat at the table where they could negotiate with far more powerful corporations or government to get what they want. And in India, I discovered civil society does not want to come to the table. They think engaging in negotiation is selling out. They think that the only way they can take care of the rights of minorities, because they're very clear, they're for minorities. whether it be women, lower caste people, workers, LGBT, it doesn't matter what the minority is, the weak. They believe the only way they can advance their goals is by attacking and forcing people in power to give them what they want. This was shocking for me because remember, for 1995 to 2005, I was in the rarefied environment of Boston and Cambridge, where Harvard and MIT had created these beautiful processes. And the work I did in the America of the late 90s, which was, I believe, one of the most liberal, and I use this word uh, partly as a pun, agreeable societies on the planet. And when there were disputes and I was called in, there was a culture of sitting across the table. There was a culture of listening. There was a culture of compromise and even sacrifice in order to come to a common understanding. So this
But do
doesn't exist anymore in the US. Go
But
on.
do you, could I just chip in, Ashok? Because you said about India and you didn't think it had a social contract. But isn't it, does not India must have a degree of social contract because there's stability within the country, and it's had it for a very great amount of time, like even pre-independence, post-independence. It's been a very civilized place by the standards of most places in the world. So that's the first thing. You also said about, I mean, I would be amazed if India had less of a social contract than Spain. I'm absolutely certain that India is a more stable, more democratically minded country than Spain. You say that we think of West and we think of Western Europe, America, but that's not really what I mean. I'm talking about the tradition, if you will, the tradition that's come out almost like the Anglo tradition, which of course also was in India and was in India far before Spain, which of course has only been a democracy since 1975. Sorry, well, that was when Franco died, but I mean, really since 1980. And it's not really based in any way upon what it's based upon is silence. So basically, all the Franco guys and all the Republican guys agreed that they would forget all about all the terrible things that happened, and they'd be quiet and they'd create a society based on culture. And so we now live in a culture, and on the surface, if I went out in the street now, it appears extremely stable, everyone's happy, there's no hint of any violence in the past. You, a stranger, wouldn't be aware. But I feel is very skin deep because the kind of discussion that we're having today, I don't think would be possible with Spanish people. I don't feel there's that level of democratic discussion where you have a stake in society, however small, and you can communicate ideas that go against the status quo. For example, Spain is a country where there is a functionary class, where there is a people who pass civil service exams, who live the life of Riley, leave at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and they basically live a great life. They can't get sacked from their jobs. And people who are not in that system suffer a lot and are very much under the thumb of people in power over them. And people have to just be quiet about it and they can't change it. So I would feel that India is more than Spain. I feel we define West wrongly. And as Peter said in the chat here, I don't feel that the majority of people in any society are liberal or have the liberal mindset. I don't think the majority of people in Britain have the liberal mindset. But what they do have, or did have, and hopefully will continue to have, is a consensus, a contract, an agreement that if we can maintain our way of life, if we can maintain what makes us an organic country, as well as making sure we improve the lot of the poor as well, to keep that side of the social conservatives on board, then we will continue to maintain and respect the legal rights we've already granted to minorities. And those minorities will improve as on a case-by-case basis under the common law system. So it's not really a case that they have a liberal mindset, but that there's just that they accept the contract they've signed in return for maintaining their way of life. So I'm wondering how different India is from Britain, really. And I'm sure that India is more accepting of liberal institutions than Spain, which is a much younger democracy.
Okay.
Am I wrong?
Thank you so much for introducing another country into
Yeah.
the mix, Spain. Fascinating. And this is the only way we can have this conversation. And Peter, thank you for your thoughts. And I will allude to some of them here. Uh, but the first thing, let me make a distinction between stability and a nation having freedoms and rights. The most stable societies are authoritarian societies. I came to this conclusion only given my consulting, both at community levels as well as organizational levels. I can't tell you the number of times I have worked with companies that were created by visionaries who wanted a flat organization, who were against hierarchy, your archetypal Silicon Valley visionaries who, foosball and, everyone wearing shorts and t-shirts and no hierarchy. And how quickly they collapsed into chaos unless somebody took control of the things that really mattered. So, coming to India, India, despite our democracy, and I want to make a distinction between two things: nominal democracy, the constitution, the Indian constitution is phenomenal, wonderful. The laws, the capacity to enforce the laws, and the lives of ordinary citizens. These don't always function at the same level. So, what India has going for it is a great constitution, a judicial system that has withstood a lot of attacks, but it's still by and large functional. An administrative system which has become very corrupted, but still exists. But its stability doesn't come from any of this. Its stability comes from its people knowing their place in society. It's the equivalent of the old class system in the in the UK. In India, the only way out for someone from the lower classes and castes is by making extraordinary money. And even then, there's a difference. You're never really accepted. But when I say we don't have a liberal mindset, I'm not talking of the whole country. Obviously, you're right. Peter is right. Not even during the best of British or American democracies did a majority have a liberal mindset. That's not possible. The majority are usually conservative. What I discovered in India, and this is why I talk of India as illiberal, is that the so-called liberals are extraordinarily conservative. They may be for gay rights, they may be for women's rights, but their mindset, and this is the mindset that they showed when I invited them for dialogue or negotiation with their opposite counterparts. They didn't feel any need to talk with anyone outside of their club. So when I talk of Indian illiberalism, I am talking of the fact that even our elite are, well, they may not be conservative, they are extremely illiberal. And what this has done, and short history, but starting from around 1970, when Mrs. Gandhi took power, the Nehruvian contract, not a social contract, it was a political contract, of which political parties, including the communists, had signed up for. The ordinary people didn't. They didn't no clue what was happening. But the
Mm.
political contract held until Mrs. Gandhi became dictatorial, and then everything went to the dogs. We've never recovered that political contract. So we are now functioning as a semi authoritarian electoral democracy with very wobbly institutions and an extremely illiberal citizenry. Extremely illiberal citizenry. Now, I don't know anything about Spain, but you know, uh, I can completely understand how coming out of Franco, Spain hasn't developed that level of liberal thinking. Even the elite may not have. And I get that. And you're right, I use the word West loosely. I'm really referring to the Anglo-Saxon countries and to some extent the Scandinavians, the Germans, the French. I'm really talking about that primarily because of another bias that I have. My bias coming out of my work in India is that liberal democracy cannot exist anywhere in the world outside of my narrow definition of the West. In fact, this might sound either megalomaniacal or quixotic. It's probably quixotic. But when I decided in 2015 to leave India, which I never thought I would do, and come to the US, I came because I wanted to try to tell as many people as possible, educate people about the vulnerabilities of Western democracies. Because sitting in India, I saw the chaos around the killing of George uh,
Floyd.
Floyd,
Mm.
the Black Lives Matter, the burning during Obama's era, the Me Too movement, the beginning of the trans movement. And I was sitting there in India despairing about Indian democracy. And I looked at America and I said, what the hell are Americans doing to themselves? You have a system that is by and large functional, and you are finding new reasons to beat upon each other. To be completely candid, because I don't say this often, because it comes across as ridiculous, but I literally came back in 2017 because I my only commitment is to trying to somehow work with people to protect whatever is left of these Western democracies. Now, I see that Peter has put a couple of comments, and uh, you're right. I want to comment on authoritarian systems, Peter. I know that for a long time, I too thought that authoritarian systems were very vulnerable and that democratic systems had the capacity to self correct. But I don't believe that anymore because, and it. I let me go to this. Here's really where I how I see the vulnerability of democratic countries. Free speech. Let's just take free speech. Free speech requires the capacity of the system to handle and manage differing opinions and dissent. To add to that, you add protest, you add civil disobedience, and the amount of energy needed to manage all of that is extremely high. So here's the way I look at it. In a democratic system, because dissent is allowed, and so many wonderful things come out of dissent, including creativity and new ideas. The system needs enormous resources and energies to sustain itself. If it can't invest that level of continuing energies and resources, the tensions increase, the conflicts increase, and the system implodes. It can also be taken advantage of by external bad actors. When I talk of authoritarian systems, I'm not talking of North Korea or Cuba. I'm talking of countries like the UAE and Saudi. I'm talking of dictatorships that are able to have another kind of social contract with their people, allowing them. And this is because my family lived for many years in those countries. This is the social contract. There's, you can come here, there are no taxes. You can make as much money as you want. You can repatriate it, but you will keep your mouth shut. And no matter what we do, like the brutal treatment of workers in summer in building the World Cup stadium in Qatar, just one example. No matter what we do, you shall not complain. If you do, we will either deport you or kill you. End of story. That is the kind of authoritarian government I'm talking about as as a stable, sustainable hell. It's hell because it's not what I want. It's not where I want to live. And it's where droves of people from all over the world go. My family went there because they were willing to, this was the trade off. They were willing to give up their freedoms and rights in order to have a material, good material life. And now, of course, with universities, NYU and Cornell and all these universities rushing there to set up campuses, there is nothing you can't get in those countries. They are almost perfect societies. So anyway,
No, I
I'm I'm past. Please take over, Daniel.
Yeah, well, I also wanted to challenge a little bit the comment about authoritarianism being more stable a little bit, because I do feel that authoritarianism isn't very stable. It's stable on the surface, of course. If you look at a country like China, it looks like everything's running with great efficiency. But the problem is that people cannot regulate their actions because they cannot be certain about what to do and what may land them in trouble. I really enjoyed reading or listening to lectures by a man called Frank Dicota, who is an expert on China, particularly in the Maoist times. And he said that there's nothing more unstable than a dictatorship because you try to do things to please the boss, and those things could 10 years down the line end up with you being executed. They basically vague diktats are given, and there's nothing to flesh them out, so you don't know what to do. And that lack of certainty mitigates against stability. Now, if you were to compare that with an Anglo system, by Anglo system, any system influenced in the British Empire realm, including India, these systems work under the common law, which is to say, yes, there is legislation created in our parliaments, but that legislation in and of itself is not that clear and is open to many interpretations. So what happens in reality is that people do whatever they do and cases go to court. And then the judges have to decide in that particular case, according to that particular legislation, what's the result. And then we find the law is refined more and more. So people know in specific cases what they can and can't do. You haven't got that uncertainty that you have in the autocratic system. So and then the judges in cases to come is bound by precedent. So they are forced to a great extent to follow what came before. So the whole thing is embodied with, yes, Peter, sorry?
Peter, do you want to add something?
Sorry. Yeah, I'd like to participate, but I don't want to interrupt at all. I'll wait my turn.
All right, Peter, thanks. Basically, so I just wanted to say about our common law systems that they are basically working on a case-by-case basis. So generally, it's very clear what people can do, unlike in an authoritarian system, okay? And even when you come to those places where it's very unclear what the law is, the kind of places that end up in the American Supreme Court or Supreme Court in whatever your country is, that basically there, when they've got to decide, they think about the principles within the system, which are very much embodied with our subliminally with our religious philosophy of the kind of biblical equal human dignity, and they tend to go in that direction. So at all times, we are very, very kind of certain as people what to do. As I said, Roger Scruton, a conservative, said, yes, we have freedom is where the law permits us to act. So we have a lot of that. The issue to my mind is that we need to keep within our social contract. So if a judge is too activist, if they are seen as making things up that we're not bound by precedent, that's affecting the social contract for one thing. We've talked about issues of immigration. Also, if there's a feeling that people, their living standards aren't rising, that will affect whether poor social conservatives feel part of the contract. And finally, if people who are called liberals, I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about very privileged people who say that call themselves liberals, if they kind of feel that they're taking the mickey out of the way of life of ordinary people, such as someone in Britain called Emily Thornberry, who saw an English flag outside someone's house and put it on Twitter and kind of mocked it, then the people who are poor don't feel that their political party, the Labour Party, is representing them. So these are all different things that are affecting the liberal social contract, but nonetheless, it's still more stable than in an authoritarian regime. Sorry, Peter.
So, Peter, I'm just curious. Do you want to talk more about the social contract, or do you want to take on another point? I ask because if it's the social contract you want to talk about, please say that now, because I feel I need to clarify what I mean about it. But if you want to go down another path, I would rather talk first.
Well, you're in charge of this, so you can curate this discussion. I want to talk about the social contract. I want to join issue with things that. Oh yeah, well that's the theme for today.
Right, exactly.
So I assume.
Thank you.
So this is a wonderful, fascinating conversation, and everyone's points and arguments are not only valid, they're insightful and interesting. Let me just say what I mean when I say, first of all, on the matter of the stability of authoritarianism, I'm on all fours with what Daniel said. I have to say, with great respect, history and the study of politics shows clearly that authoritarian regimes are highly unstable, which is why they require an enormous amount of state resources expended in the way of coercion, both coercion of the body and coercion of the mind of its citizens. And without that coercion, there's no prospect of authoritarian regimes subsisting or surviving. When you talk about the contract, the social contract, Ashok, that is made, for example, in the UAE, that, with respect, is not a social contract. It is a form of a bargain. It is a type of bargain that is made by those people who either go to those places or agree to live in those places. There is this grudging acceptance, if you will, of the conditions, okay, of the terms of living peaceably and peacefully. That is not what social contract means in any sense. Just to take things back a step, when we're talking about social contract, and there are so many different ways of thinking about it, we have to begin with addressing the different conceptions of human nature, the competing conceptions of human nature on which the notion of social
Peter,
contract is.
Peter, if you don't
Sorry,
mind, no. I just want to make sure, because I think I have been misunderstood about stability and authoritarian stability. So if Daniel and you are going to build on a version of your understanding of what I mean, then this conversation is actually going down a path which is not probably as useful. Let me be very clear. I do not at all endorse authoritarian systems
of
at
course,
all. At
of
all.
course you do.
No, so let me finish. I am
Ashok, let me stop you there for.
no. Let me. I'm not responding only to you. I'm responding to Daniel. When I say authoritarian systems are more stable, I'm not talking of them being perfect. Any
No,
system,
we all know that.
but oh,
We
Peter,
all
if you
agree
don't
on
mind,
that, Ashok.
Peter, if you don't mind, every system requires enormous energy to sustain. You know this, I know this. Authoritarian systems require I totally agree with how you and Daniel have talked about the instability of authoritarian systems. I don't disagree with that. I am merely talking of a different kind of energy that is needed to sustain democratic systems. And in my experience, again, like you, I have also immersed myself in history. Pretty much every civilization, empire throughout history has been authoritarian. And you're right, when they're authoritarian, there will always be uh, uh, opponents or enemies who will overthrow existing systems and try to set up their own systems. And in the in between spaces, there will be chaos. That's absolutely true. Now, when I talk about democracy, and maybe this is where I'm coming from as a practitioner, having worked with, literally rolled up my sleeves and gotten into the dirt of conflicts and disputes in flat, non-hierarchical organizations, as well as in communities. As a facilitator, I have become extremely conscious of the extraordinary resources and energies that are needed in order to even maintain a modicum of stability. And that's where I'm coming from. When I say that democratic systems are unstable, inherently by design, because of our openness to change, our openness to diversity and dissent and protest and everything else, I am not necessarily therefore saying that authoritarian systems are good. I'm merely saying that the it boils down to entropy. The ways in which authoritarian systems break down is when they run out of the energy needed to suppress dissent. The ways in which democratic systems fail is when we run out of energy to allow for dissent. This is the distinction. Now, obviously, we've all seen the dictatorships that collapse left, right, and center. Africa is a great example. So many African countries that are run by dictators and that collapse. So I think it's I'm not favoring in any way authoritarian stability. I'm merely saying that in a democracy, you need enormous energy to manage dissent. In an authoritarian system, you need enormous energy to suppress dissent. That's the only point. But please feel free to add your bit, Peter, as well as anyone else.
Ashok,
Yes, sir.
with respect,
Yes, sir.
nobody, neither Daniel nor myself were suggesting or even imagined that you were favoring or endorsing authoritarianism. We understood you. I certainly did the first time. Okay. And the issue has to do objectively with what we mean by stability, not whether we favor one system of societal arrangements over another. Okay. I disagree with you on the issue of the causes of instability in a democracy, but I do agree with you that a democracy requires enormous efforts and resources and energy in order to remain vital as a democracy, as opposed to something else, something less than a democracy, something that backslides or declines or degenerates or decays. On that, I agree with you completely. The paradox is that democracies are only overthrown by coups, and authoritarian regimes are overthrown both by coups and by revolutions. And in the case of the point here is not to prefer one over the other. The point
Right.
is to get to the core issue of this talk today, of this discussion on the nature of social contract. And what I was wanting to move us towards, although our time's running out here, was to understand that there are a couple of different ways, at least, to think about social contract. But in all cases, when we talk about contract, we are talking about a kind of engagement, a kind of societal arrangement that results from the consent, tacit or otherwise, and generally we're talking about tacit consent, even imagined consent. All right, in the case of the John Rawls' thought experiment, constructing a system of justice based on, under a veil of ignorance. All right, which Daniel was beginning to talk about. But in all cases, we are imagining a free citizenry. In all cases, we cannot have any kind of what's called social contract in circumstances where consent would automatically be vitiated ab initio at the very outset by virtue of the fact that the free and equal moral character of each and every citizen is denied right up front. So the fact that we may enter into a bargain where we're prepared to take prosperity, let's call it that, or affluence, all right, at a price of our liberty. That's not in any sense a social contract. It is a bargain. It is a bargain, but it's not a social contract, because social contract can only be, like any contract, by the way, can only be entered into on behalf of free and equal moral persons. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that there are two conceptions of human nature that we have to at least address here. Daniel talked about Hobbes and then others. Hobbes' conception of human nature was that life in the state of nature, as we know, is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so living in civil society under a strong sovereign is a way of protecting or guarding against our nasty inclinations. Rousseau, on the other hand, saw life in the state of nature as exactly the opposite. He saw human beings not being nasty, not being greedy, not being murderous, but quite the opposite. And that it was in civil society where we became competitive. And it's interesting because Freud kind of bought into Rousseau's notion a little bit. That you've read Civilization and Its Discontents. Neurosis, his concept of neurosis, is something that arises when we live in civil society and compete with one another and have to sort of forego certain liberties in exchange for the respect for other people's exercise of their rights. What I just want to say here about the social contract is that even in Western democracies, because you made an interesting observation, Ashok, you said it's only in the Western world that we could have liberal democracy. There's a sense in which that's correct in my judgment, but it needn't be the case. What I want to say is it needn't be the case, even though I think you're correct that it is the case. It needn't be the case because the democratic impulse exists in everyone, although it needs to be conditioned. We can see evidence of this in the Arab Spring. We can see evidence of this in many revolutions that produce ultimately totalitarian regimes that begin. I mean, you can even look at the French Revolution, La Grande Terreur, and look at what kind of authoritarianism was produced in the first round out of the French Revolution, long before we have the Republic and we have something that looks like democracy. You can look at the Soviet system, which begins with a promise of acknowledgement of the dignity and the needs of everyone, and ends up being a dictatorship, right? Sorry.
Thank you. And you and I have a lot to talk about, and I hope we get an opportunity to do so. I want to make sure that the others get a chance to add their bit. But before I and I really would like to hear from each one of you from whichever perspective you come from. But before I do that, I just want to say that I completely agree with Peter's idea of diversity increasing complexity, and that diversity does not naturally strengthen society, and which is what feeds into my notion that the greater the diversity, the greater the energy required to sustain that society. So, having said that, that we've opened up, like, and this is something that happens even when Rukmini and I talk. We've opened up a lot of thoughts and questions. So, I would really like to hear from Yona, Peter Shapiro, Amrita, anyone, your thoughts. Who would like to go first? And please respond in any which way. You can, don't necessarily respond to what I said or Daniel said or Peter said. What are you taking away from this conversation? Yona?
Thanks, Ashok. I'm always interested in these very big picture conversations about what do they point at in terms of opportunity or possibility for movement. Speaking of watching the mind, one of the things that happens in my mind with these very sort of like zoomed out and fascinating discussions is like, all right, well, what's to be done? You know, because I think everyone in this conversation has pointed to some very serious issues, and perhaps there is no role for the drop to play in the ocean. Perhaps there is. This raised many questions along those lines for me in terms of strategy and tactics, and I remain with those questions.
Thank you. Quanta.
Thank you very much. I perceived a few contradictions, and I wanted to explore that. in one sense, Salman Rushdie's unbridled freedom and unlimited freedom to write something that offended other people, but at the same time, condoning authoritarianism as a more, you said something like a society that is more peaceful, illiberal. So I do think that excessive individualism and unlimited liberty is like driving a car and driving any way you want. It doesn't matter if you hit other people, you pass through the stoplights, and you're free. You're free to drive any way you want. So, but when you do that, then what kind of society are we going to have if Salman Rushdie-like freedom exists at the expense of social unrest?
Thank you. Thank you. Peter, Shapiro, Prabha, Amrita. Peter, go on.
One, if I'm sorry, unless somebody else wants to speak. I mean, I want to make one comment, then go back to a general thought that I have. I mean, I'm just going to name this issue in American society. Originally, male teenagers transing into girls and playing on girls' sports teams. And they are male bodies who are typically or traditionally stronger than women's bodies, and in soccer fields and rugby fields. It seems on the face of it like let's stop that for the sake of giving girls a better opportunity to compete without having transed boy into girls competing. But liberals, if they say no to that, can they survive? Because the notion of being respectful of all needs and interests of all different disaffected parties means that you can't say one party should have rights and another party can't have rights.
Thank you for saying that, Peter. And this is for me, and again, this is because of my background in conflict resolution, the trade-offs that you're talking about. And one of the biggest reasons why we paint ourselves into corners is because once we have accepted the idea that all diversity must be respected, and for some people it must be celebrated, we are terrified of scaling back on any of these because we see that as a slippery slope, which will take away all our freedoms and rights. So what you're talking about is the example of trans rights and the reluctance of many, I want to say, progressives to be flexible or even to roll back some of their previous strong statements is because they are terrified of, in the process, losing gay marriage, having gay people go back into the closet, losing women's rights. So you're talking of a very important challenge. And yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Prabha, Amrita, who would like to go next?
Sorry, Ashok. This is Prabha. I'm driving. I just pulled over just not to be rude, but it's been fascinating, the irony of what you have created the space for and the very exploration of the possibilities. What I am struck by is a real desire to pick up on a couple of threads, and I think particularly on the idea of the social contract and what that takes, and what I think Peter ended with, what it is and what it can be, that it doesn't need to be. So just thinking about what is the kind of exploration it will take to look at what it can be under which circumstances. So thank you. I just loved it.
Thank you. Amrita?
Hi, and good morning. It's a Sunday morning. This is the first I've joined a conversation like this. Thoroughly enjoying all the viewpoints, and thank you, everybody. I've just been listening in and, trying to absorb everything and, understand the different viewpoints. I again, yes, a few things that, this thing about social contract. And how I understood it, because I've lived in Abu Dhabi for about 20 years, and I've lived from 2000 to 2020, which is when it made the greatest transition in their social structures, in their acceptance, and acceptance of foreign nationals coming in and residing in the country. And yes, I'd seen it from really where there were no proper street lightings in Abu Dhabi. It was very, very exclusive. It was dark. It was secretive. And Dubai was the point, and, where everything was happening, and how, with the change of monarchies and things, it changed. Mindsets changed. People began to open up. But at the end of it all, yes, you still were not a national of the country. You still could not build a home which you could pass on to your generations. There were certain things where it was very clear to the person that you're just there for the contract as long as the contract is there. So people had a very, it was a transitional kind of a society. It was always come and go. People rarely stayed there for more than 4 or 5 years. But things were in place because these things were clarified in the beginning.
Yes.
Yes. And the one thing that was also very, very clear is you don't mess with our religion. We are an Islamist state. And I remember the guidance I got, from people around or from my own thinking, that I'm there for a purpose. I make my money. I forward my profession, and I respect the laws of the land. So the way I saw it was just respecting the laws of the land. I did not see it as an oppression. I was able to process that in my mind. And so I was happy. I was able to mingle with the crowd. I was probably the only Indian and the only Hindu in a large society of 800 employees. And I didn't feel so much as not being a part of the society, because like me, everybody else was an expatriate. And we knew how far we could go. We knew what our expectations were. We had no false hopes. And we appreciated, we were truly grateful that they let us live our life, enjoy the benefits, drive the lovely cars down the beautiful roads. And there were no distinctions at all, on the face of it. And that was all that mattered.
Yes.
So I think
Thank
there was a
you.
lot of very mutual respect there. And I think we go back to this point that if we have to achieve anything in this world, within ourselves, whatever, we just have to come to terms with the fact that we are just a part of a larger, entity. And we just have to respect our own space first, and then the space of others.
Thank
So
you.
just a very simple thought.
Yeah, but this is your having lived for 20 years in Abu Dhabi
Yeah.
really helps this conversation, because, and Peter is right, it wasn't a social contract that these countries have. It's an employment contract. Okay. and
Exactly.
and that's very clear. And in a way, what you are describing is what I am calling a stable authoritarian state. It's very different from Idi Amin's Uganda, very different from even Rwanda or DRC or any of those places. It's a it's 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 by no means liberal, and yet in a way it's tolerant. So it's a very interesting thing. Daniel, I want you to wrap it up.
All right.
So I want to hear your experience of this whole session. Um, Pick it up anywhere you want, go wherever you want. But yeah.
Yeah, I think what I found interesting, and I've got to think about now, is this issue of UAE, which has come up in this conversation a lot now. What kind of contract, if it is a contract or bargain, it represents? I mean, I would say, for me, these societies, the reason they're not democratic, and the reason I wouldn't call it a social contract, is you have a small amount of citizens and a large amount of, let's put it in non-pejorative terms, employees. And basically, these people, therefore, the majority have not made a contract. The majority haven't decided. It's more like you have a group at the top, and more like, I don't want to use slave class, but you know what I'm trying to say. There are people who are not citizens, as it was in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But there is a key thread between even the UAE on one side and the UK and the USA on the other. And it's this: whether the country has a small amount of the people at the top deciding, that's the UAE, or the majority deciding, which is what happens in the UK, where you have a social contract among a wide group of people, which I would say promotes stability. There are a group of people like me in the UK who have less stake, who have less say, because we are minorities, in my view, real minorities, that didn't form part of this contract. And so I, like the last speaker, in a sense, have a very similar experience, because I also had to respect the religion of the country, respect the customs of the country, continue. I could question it, of course. I'm not going to go to prison, but in terms of changing it, very hard. And like she had to accept that, and Rita had to accept it to be in the UAE. I, to a large extent, have to accept it because I'm in the UK, in the democratic system. But what we all want, whether it's a bargain from a small amount of people or a contract with a majority of people, the people who are in the minority of a minority, it is in our interest to maintain the stability of our societies. Otherwise, we're not going to maintain our rights. And it's my concern, my deep concern, that if what we might call the conservatives in the society are annoyed too much, it's me and people like me who are going to suffer and have nowhere to go. And this is why, as what I would call a liberal person, we need to seriously think about who's in charge. And although I would love to say that I am equal in charge, I know that there are people in my society who have more power, and I would like to keep my rights. I am part of the conversation in the UK or in all these democratic countries, but we need to have a degree of realism about really the foundations of our society, or we're going to be in trouble. We need to know how far we can push it and how far we can't push it. And I think that's what all of us nomadic types have to face. And it is not good, and it's not just, and it's not the way we want it to be. And it's good that in places like the UK, we're going in a direction of more equality. But nonetheless, we need to be attuned to the reality, I think. And I think that's what this discussion has tried to bring out.
Thank you. And I want to just end by thanking all of you. Peter, Amrita, Prabha, Quanta, and of course you, Daniel. And I think you, especially what Peter Shapiro and Daniel have just, with your closing remarks, what you have said points me to our biggest challenge. How do we balance our need to maintain the highest values, liberal democratic values? How do we balance that with the fact that many of us, particularly Daniel's minority of a minority of a minority, will never have the same power as that of the others? And my 20-second rant about American progressivism is this, that the smallest minority in America believes they have the right to change the system. And that is one of the main reasons why I believe American and Western democracies are extremely vulnerable and fragile today. Thank you very much, everybody. And about 5 people showed up today, which is wonderful. It would be great if you can tell your friends and your colleagues, and you can make uh, Mindwatch or mind watching a Sunday habit. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy what's left of your weekend and stay safe.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.